The United States is at war with Iran. American bombs are falling on Iranian military installations, Iranian drones are striking oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz, and crude oil is trading above $100 a barrel for the first time in years. And yet, on this very day, the Trump administration made a decision that sounds almost paradoxical. It temporarily lifted sanctions on Iranian oil. The country the United States is actively bombing is now being allowed to sell its crude on the open market, with Washington's blessing. This is not a peace offering. According to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, it is a weapon, a way to use Iran's own oil against it. But behind the strategic framing lies a more uncomfortable truth. 3 weeks into this war, the White House is running out of options to contain an energy crisis that is hitting American wallets harder every day. The question is no longer just about geopolitics. It is about the price at the pump and the midterm elections in November. On Friday, March 20th, 2026, the United States Treasury Department issued what it called a narrowly tailored short-term authorization, permitting the purchase of Iranian oil that is currently sitting on tankers at sea. The license, according to CBS News and multiple outlets, covers only barrels that were loaded onto ships before midnight Eastern Time on Friday. It expires on April 19th. Treasury Secretary Bessent framed the move as injecting roughly 140 million barrels of crude into global markets, enough to satisfy world demand for approximately a day and a half, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. The decision comes exactly 3 weeks after the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes against Iran on February 28, 2026, in an operation Washington has called Epic Fury. The strikes targeted military facilities, nuclear sites, and Iranian leadership, including, according to reports from multiple news agencies, a strike that killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Iran's response was swift and devastating, not primarily on the battlefield, but on the global economy. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps declared the Strait of Hormuz closed, first to Western Allied ships and then, effectively, to nearly all commercial traffic. Tanker movements through the strait, which normally carries roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil trade, fell by approximately 70% within days, according to ship tracking data cited by Bloomberg. The economic fallout has been immediate. Brent crude surged from around $65 per barrel before the war to a peak near $126, before settling around $107 to $112 this week, according to Fortune and Bloomberg. The average price of regular gasoline in the United States jumped from $2.98 per gallon before the war to $3.91 as of Friday, according to AAA, the highest since late 2022. Diesel reached nearly $5.07 per gallon. For the Trump administration, which came into office promising economic relief, the numbers are politically toxic. Iran has threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz for decades. It never actually did, until now. What changed was the scale and nature of the provocation. The February 28 strikes, which came after failed nuclear negotiations in Geneva and a prior 12-day air conflict in mid-2025, represented the most significant direct military assault on Iranian territory by the United States and Israel in modern history. The killing of the supreme leader was an escalation without precedent in the post-1979 relationship between Washington and Tehran. Iran's response drew on a playbook it had long rehearsed but never fully executed. As NPR reported, Iran did not need a traditional naval blockade with mines and warships. Instead, the IRGC used relatively inexpensive drone strikes in the vicinity of the strait, which was enough to trigger what one energy analyst described as an insurance-driven shutdown. Underwriters would not cover the passage, shipping companies would not risk it without coverage, and traffic ground to a halt. By March 8th, according to a Congressional Research Service report, the United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operations Center had recorded at least 10 attacks on commercial ships, killing 5 crew members. By mid-March, according to Bloomberg, fewer than 100 commercial vessels had crossed the strait since March 1st, compared to the hundreds that normally transit every week. The precedent that shaped Washington's response was the 2022 energy crisis following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Then, President Biden authorized a massive drawdown of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and coordinated with the International Energy Agency to stabilize prices. The Trump administration, despite having fiercely criticized Biden's reserve drawdowns, found itself reaching for the same tools and going further. Within 2 weeks of the war's start, Trump authorized the release of 172 million barrels from the reserve, part of a coordinated IEA release of 400 million barrels. He also waived the Jones Act for 60 days and lifted sanctions on Russian oil already at sea. The Iranian oil sanctions waiver is the latest step on this escalating ladder. The actors in this drama are operating with sharply divergent and sometimes contradictory imperatives. The Trump administration faces a fundamental tension between its military objectives and its economic reality. Operation Epic Fury aims to degrade Iran's military capabilities, damage its nuclear program, and pressure Tehran into negotiations. But Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz has imposed enormous economic costs that the White House did not fully anticipate, according to CNN, which reported that administration officials now privately estimate that higher prices could linger for months. The midterm elections in November are a political clock ticking in the background. Gas prices above $3.50 per gallon have historically been a danger zone for incumbent parties. The sanctions waiver is an attempt to thread an impossible needle, maintain maximum pressure on Iran while easing the economic pain that pressure is causing at home. Iran, now under the leadership of Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the killed supreme leader, has turned the Strait of Hormuz into its most potent strategic weapon by selectively allowing some ships through, particularly those linked to China, India, Turkey, and Pakistan. Tehran has demonstrated that it can weaponize energy flows without a total blockade. Iran's calculus is that economic pain will fracture the coalition supporting the war, particularly among energy-dependent allies in Europe and Asia. According to Time magazine, the new supreme leader has vowed to keep the strait closed and called on Gulf states to shut down American military bases. China occupies a pivotal position. As the largest importer of Iranian oil, purchasing more than 90% of Iran's crude during the sanctions period, according to Treasury Secretary Brent, Beijing has significant leverage. The sanctions waiver is explicitly designed to redirect oil that would have gone to China at discounted prices toward other buyers in Southeast Asia and South Asia at market rates. Chinese state-owned COSCO Shipping has suspended new bookings for Middle Eastern routes, according to Lloyd's List intelligence cited by CNBC, though some China-linked vessels have attempted transit. Gulf producers, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, and Iraq, are caught in the crossfire, both literally and economically. With the strait closed, they cannot export their oil, even as their own energy infrastructure has come under Iranian retaliatory strikes. Kuwait's Mina al-Ahmadi refinery was struck by Iranian drones as recently as March 20th, according to Argus Media. The IEA estimates that Gulf countries have been forced to cut total oil production by at least 10 million barrels per day. Qatar's Ras Laffan liquefied natural gas facility was damaged in Israeli-Iranian exchanges, with Qatar Energy saying it could take up to 5 years to fully repair, according to CNN. European allies and NATO partners have been notably reluctant to join American efforts to secure the strait. The United Kingdom has sent military planners, but emphasized it will not be drawn into the wider war. Most European allies, according to Al Jazeera, opposed the war from the beginning, making them less inclined to provide operational support. The numbers tell a stark story. The International Energy Agency's March 2026 oil market report described the Strait of Hormuz crisis as the largest disruption to global oil supply in history. Nearly 20 million barrels per day of crude and product exports that normally transit the strait have been reduced to a trickle. The IEA estimates that global oil supply plunged by 8 million barrels per day in March, with at least 10 million barrels per day of production curtailed in the Middle East alone. More than 4 million barrels per day of refining capacity in the region is at risk, as refineries shut down from attacks or because storage tanks are full with no way to export. For American consumers, the impact is direct and visceral. Gas prices have risen over 30% in 3 weeks. The Energy Information Administration projects that U.S. gasoline costs for 2026 could average around $3.34 per gallon, a significant revision from the pre-war forecast of $2.91. The EIA does not see prices falling below $3 per gallon at any point before the end of 2027. Goldman Sachs warned that Brent crude could exceed its all-time high of approximately $147 per barrel set in 2008 if supply disruptions through the strait are prolonged. In a more favorable scenario with shipping gradually resuming from April, Goldman sees Brent easing to the $70 range by the fourth quarter of 2026. The cascade of policy responses illustrates the severity. The administration has now deployed virtually every available lever. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve drawdown of 172 million barrels, the IEA coordinated release of 400 million barrels, the Jones Act waiver, the lifting of sanctions on Russian oil at sea, freeing roughly 130 million barrels, according to Brent, the easing of restrictions on Venezuelan oil sales, and now the Iranian oil sanctions waiver. As one energy analyst quoted by CBS News put it, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve can help, but it's not a silver bullet. The sanctions waiver has produced a rare moment of near-universal commentary, though perspectives diverge sharply on its wisdom. Gregory Brew, a senior analyst at the Eurasia Group specializing in oil and gas, told CNN that if the administration pursues this strategy and allows buyers to purchase oil already on the water, it will move quickly. But he noted the obvious follow-up question. Once floating storage is depleted, the administration may face pressure to drop sanctions on Iranian oil production more broadly, an even more politically fraught step. Nicholas Mulder, a sanctions expert and professor at Cornell University, offered a pointed assessment to Axios. The administration is conceding in war what it was unwilling to give in peace. The paradox is unmistakable. For years, Iran sought sanctions relief through diplomatic negotiations, and the Trump administration refused. Now, in the middle of an armed conflict, that same relief is being granted, not as a concession to Tehran, but as a tool to manage the economic fallout of the very war Washington initiated. Congressional critics have been vocal on both sides of the aisle. Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut called the move sickeningly, shamefully stupid, arguing it would boost Tehran's war chest. Senator Andy Kim of New Jersey accused the administration of simultaneously enriching both Russia and Iran while taking money from American families through higher prices. Former Trump communications director Anthony Scaramucci captured the irony on social media, summarizing the logic as, attack Iranian oil facilities to hurt the regime, then lift sanctions so Iran can sell oil, then use the revenue from that oil to continue bombing the regime. Administration officials, for their part, have argued that the move is strategically sound. Iran was going to sell those barrels to China regardless of sanctions, they contend. By making them available to other buyers, the United States diverts supply away from Beijing and toward allies in Southeast and South Asia who are willing to pay market prices. Besant has emphasized that Iran will have difficulty accessing the revenue generated, as the United States will continue to restrict Tehran's access to the international financial system. Kevin Book, co-founder of research firm Clearview Energy Partners, told NPR that the effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz represented the worst-case scenario for global oil markets, about as wrong as things could go at any single point of failure. The question for analysts is not whether the sanctions waiver will help, but whether it will help enough, and for how long. The reverberations of the Strait of Hormuz crisis extend far beyond oil markets. The IEA warned that plunging supplies of liquefied petroleum gas and naphtha are already forcing petrochemical plants worldwide to curb polymer production. LPG supplies used for cooking and heating in India and East Africa are at particular risk. Fertilizer shortages stemming from disrupted natural gas supplies could trigger food price increases in vulnerable regions. In Asia, the impact has been most acute. China, which receives 45% of its oil via the Strait of Hormuz, according to Al Jazeera, has been pressing Tehran to allow safe passage for its vessels. India has negotiated selective transit rights, with 2 liquefied petroleum gas carriers permitted through the strait in mid-March. But these are exceptions, not a restored flow. Natural gas prices in Europe and Asia have surged even more sharply than oil, as liquefied natural gas shipments from Qatar, the world's largest exporter, have been severely curtailed. The aviation industry has also been hit. The suspension of flights at major Middle Eastern airports has reduced global jet fuel demand, but the broader disruption to supply chains extends to freight, logistics, and manufacturing. Ocean carriers are diverting ships away from the Red Sea and Suez Canal, fearing Houthi attacks, and routing around the southern tip of Africa, adding weeks and significant costs to shipping times. The diplomatic landscape is fractured. Trump has called for a NATO-led naval coalition to secure the strait, but allies have been reluctant. Roger Shanahan, a Middle East security analyst, told Al Jazeera that because most American allies oppose the war, they feel less inclined to support its consequences. The United Kingdom has limited its involvement to planning support. France and Germany have reportedly sought separate negotiations with Iran for safe passage of their ships, according to the Financial Times. For Gulf states, the crisis is existential. Their economies depend on oil and gas exports that cannot currently leave the Persian Gulf. Richard Haass, the former president of the Council on Foreign Relations, proposed an open for all or closed to all policy in his newsletter, arguing that if Iran can selectively choose who transits the strait, the international community should prevent any Iranian oil from reaching its destination until Tehran reopens the waterway for all. The idea reflects the desperation for a strategic framework that the current patchwork of responses lacks. several critical markers will determine the trajectory of this crisis in the coming weeks. The April 19th expiration of the Iranian oil sanctions waiver is the most immediate deadline. If oil prices remain elevated, the administration will face pressure to extend or broaden the waiver, a move that would further undermine the credibility of the broader sanctions regime. If prices drop meaningfully, the administration may let the waiver expire and claim a policy success. The progress of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve drawdown, which is expected to take approximately 120 days, will provide a slow but steady supply cushion. Markets will watch whether the physical barrels actually reach refiners quickly enough to affect prices. The Trump administration's deliberations over Karg Island, the hub through which 90% of Iran's crude exports flow, represent perhaps the most consequential decision ahead. According to Axios, citing 4 sources, the White House is seriously considering an operation to occupy or blockade the island. Such a move would be a dramatic military escalation and could either break the Hormuz deadlock or deepen it catastrophically. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, has shown no signs of backing down. His first public statement reaffirmed the strategic value of the strait closure and called for continued attacks. Any diplomatic opening would likely require back-channel negotiations, possibly through Turkey, Oman, or China, that are not yet visible. Energy markets will closely watch whether Trump follows through on his suggestion, made late Friday, that he is considering winding down military operations. Bloomberg reported that Brent prices eased to around $108 per barrel in thin trading following those remarks. Any credible signal of de-escalation could move markets significantly. What the Iranian oil sanctions waiver reveals is something larger than a single policy decision. It exposes the limits of economic warfare when it collides with the reality of armed conflict. The United States built a sanctions architecture over decades to pressure Iran without firing a shot. Now, having fired the shot, it finds that the economic weapon it spent years sharpening has become a liability, not for Tehran, but for Washington. Iran's oil, once the target, has become the treatment. The paradox at the heart of this moment is not lost on anyone watching closely. The most powerful military in the world, engaged in active combat against a regional adversary, is simultaneously easing that adversary's access to the global energy market because it cannot afford the price of its own war. What this tells us about the relationship between military power and economic leverage in the 21st century may be the most important lesson of this conflict, regardless of how it ends.